A boy was born in darkness, and no one was there to see it. No records, no cradle, no name that the galaxy would remember. Only a world so forgotten that even its stars seemed ashamed to shine on it. He wasn't born in the time of empires or wars. He was born between them in the quiet road that followed the Bane lineage, when the Sith were no longer feared, but pitied. The great rule of two had devoured itself over centuries, and what was left was a scar trying to heal in secret. This child, this final shadow, came into the galaxy as little more than a contingency, a faint ember left burning in a cave no one visited. His master did not love him. He wasn't given stories, or warmth, or even a name at first. Only hunger, the kind that made your bones ache and your mind turn on itself. It was training through abandonment, and the lesson was clear. If he couldn't survive alone, he wasn't worth remembering. The Sith had fallen far since Bane. What had once been a doctrine of fire and war was now a doctrine of whispers and hiding. The boy lived in a ruin deep beneath the surface of a dead moon. There were no doors, only passageways sealed by the Force. He didn't speak for days at a time. There was nothing to say. His master, a figure draped in red and gray, rarely emerged, and when he did, it was only to ask one question. What did you learn without me? He learned to eat stone moss. He learned that insects sing before they die. He learned that the dark side wasn't a voice, it was a silence that answered back. And most of all, he learned that his pain was never private. It was watched, graded, stored like a weapon. Every broken finger, every missed breath, every scream swallowed into the cold stone, it all made him worthy. But worthy of what? He was never told. The only history he was ever given came in fragments, carved words from Bane's teachings, cryptic verses about power, survival, and betrayal. The rule of two was not taught to him like a belief. It was a sentence, a doom passed down from generation to generation, long after its meaning had bled out. His master once said, "You are not a Sith, not yet. You are a wound we haven't finished cutting." The boy didn't know his place in the galaxy. He had never seen a Jedi. He had never heard of the Republic. The Clone Wars were centuries away. The Empire wasn't even a rumor. All he knew was hunger, and that someone had come before him. The name Bane was etched into his nightmares, not as a man but as a storm. The founder of the rule of two, the destroyer of the Sith Brotherhood, the last to matter. And this child, this unnamed boy born in shadow, was the last to remember him. In the dark, the boy made up his own name. He never spoke it aloud, but he whispered it into the Force, like a promise to no one. That name was Ramage. He didn't know what it meant, but somehow it fit the shape of his pain. And so the galaxy spun on, unaware, unconcerned. Planets bloomed, armies rose, civilizations fell, all while one forgotten child clawed his way into existence beneath a surface no one cared to look under. He was not born to lead. He was not born to rule. He was born to disappear. And that's why he survived. The Sith were no longer a storm. They were a whisper, trapped between dying breaths. Ramage heard them not through teachings, but through echoes. The broken recordings of long-dead Sith Lords. The decaying holocrons with fractured memories. The fading energies of temples abandoned by time. His master never explained their purpose. He simply pointed and said, "Listen." And so Ramage listened. He listened to Darth Nihilus speak hunger into the void. He listened to Darth Trier question loyalty like it was a disease. He listened to Darth Bane speak of destiny not as hope but as a burden. Each voice had its own cadence, its own pain, its own warning. And yet they all shared something, an understanding that power always came with loss. The rule of two wasn't created to preserve strength. It was born to contain madness, one to embody power, one to crave it. The phrase repeated itself through every hollow corridor. But Ramage didn't yet understand what it meant to crave. He didn't crave power. He craved answers. Why had the Sith fallen so far? Why had their knowledge been buried, their names forgotten? Why was he a child born in dust, the last link in a chain that had once choked the galaxy? His master gave no answers, only riddles. The Jedi think we are extinct. Good. It makes them lazy. The galaxy does not need another Sith war. It needs a reminder. Do not become powerful. Become necessary. These were not lessons. They were survival tactics. The old ways, the Brotherhood of Darkness, the armies of Korriban, the temples of Malachor, they were gone, burned away by Jedi fire and Sith betrayal. Ramage's inheritance was not glory. It was ash. He began to see the truth. He wasn't being trained to destroy the Jedi. He was being trained to preserve the Sith. At any cost. There would be no armies, no apprentices, no grand reveal, only patience, hiding, waiting, and if the time never came, then so be it. It was here in these hollow years of silent study that Ramage began to understand the weight of legacy, not as pride, but as punishment. He was the product of an unbroken chain of murderers, each master killing their student, each student becoming what they hated. Bane had called it strength. Ramage saw it as decay. He wasn't afraid of his master. He was afraid of what he would become when the time came to kill him. And that time was coming. The older he grew, the more restless he became. He began to challenge the teachings. He asked forbidden questions. He questioned the wisdom of a rule that demanded silence when the galaxy was screaming for power. Why wait? Why hide? Why let centuries pass? While Jedi grew arrogant, and the dark side withered, his master answered with violence. Not punishment, violence. He struck Ramage with a force so hard it shattered bone. He dragged him through the black sands of a tomb once ruled by Darth and Dedu. He left him bleeding beneath ancient glyphs, whispering, "This is what happens when you think you are new." Ramage didn't cry, but something inside him began to break. Not his loyalty, not his body, his patience. He began to look at the rule of two not as a sacred law, but as a prison. He started to wonder what came after the chain was broken, what came after the master was gone, what came after the whisper became a scream. And deep inside that question, the Sith began to wake again. He was not a warrior, not yet. But Ramage was no longer a child either. His frame had grown lean, his eyes sharp. The hunger that once shook his bones had quieted, replaced by something colder. He had become quiet, not because he was obedient, but because he was calculating. He was chained not by bonds of metal but by the rule, a rule he had never chosen. His master still watched from the shadows, still issued tasks wrapped in cruelty, still withheld answers as a way to shape him. But Ramage no longer feared the pain. He had learned how to separate his thoughts from his suffering, to preserve his will like a flame buried under ash. Each trial became a test of memory, each scar a question. Would he be the one to break the chain? The rituals began early, not the ancient ones, not Sith alchemy or mass illusion. These were rituals of silence, repetition, exposure. Days spent standing in acidic rain, weeks spent buried in sand up to his chest, nights without sleep, forced to recite the code of the Sith until the words bled into his dreams. Peace is a lie. The phrase no longer stung him. It comforted him. He didn't believe in peace, not because he rejected it, but because he had never seen it. There was no peace in his birth, no peace in his training, no peace in the dark halls that fed him half-truths and dead names. And when his master finally brought him before the Chamber of Blades, the training hall buried in a ringed asteroid near the unknown regions, Ramage stepped inside without hesitation. He was 13. His master summoned the droids. No explanation, no mercy, only a nod. And then steel rained from all directions. Ramage did not win, but he survived. That was enough. Later, as he lay bleeding in the corner of the chamber, staring at the curve of a blade still vibrating in the stone, his master spoke. "You are beginning to understand." Understand what? That death was always the final test? That survival was a lie without power? That the rule of two wasn't guidance, it was a cage? Ramage knew. Deep inside, he knew. The Sith didn't evolve. They repeated. Master kills apprentice. Apprentice becomes master. And the moment the apprentice grows strong, the cycle restarts. It was not a legacy. It was erosion. And still, Ramage obeyed. He studied holocrons in secret. He memorized the rise and fall of Revan, the sacrifice of Malgus, the emptiness of Nihilus. He learned how every Sith Lord, no matter how powerful, ended alone. His master once told him, "The only thing more dangerous than love is hope. Kill both before they kill you." But Ramage began to question that, not out loud, not even in his meditations, but in the way he moved, in the way he trained, in the way he began to imagine what came after obedience. The chain was not just something to break, it was something to understand. Why had no Sith ever changed it? Why had they all followed Bane's design, even as it hollowed them, even as it led to madness, betrayal, ruin? Ramage began to see the truth. The rule of two didn't ensure strength. It ensured silence. It isolated every Sith so completely that none could reshape the order. The Jedi had councils, temples, unity. The Sith had solitude and paranoia. And in that quiet corner of understanding, Ramage felt something shift inside him. Not rebellion, not rage, a quiet resistance. He would not challenge the rule openly. Not yet. But he would remember every lesson and decide for himself which were true. He was still the apprentice, still the child. But the chain was no longer wrapped around his neck. It was in his hands. A name meant nothing in the dark. Not when no one was alive to speak it. Ramage learned this slowly, over years of silence. He noticed how his master never addressed him with anything more than boy or apprentice. Not once did he offer him a title. Not once did he carve his name into stone the way ancient Sith once did for their heirs. It was as if Ramage was meant to move through life unseen, unrecorded, unclaimed. The Sith had once crafted legacies from fear. Now, they crafted ghosts. He understood then that names were not given as identity, they were granted as permission to exist. And his master had not granted him that permission yet. It was another part of the rule, another blade disguised as a lesson. If Ramage failed, the galaxy would never know he lived. The Sith would lose nothing. The chain would continue. The darkness would close behind him without leaving a trace. And so, he carried a name only in his thoughts. Ramage, a word shaped from instinct, a memory he never had, a whisper he felt rather than heard. He carved it once into the wall of his sleeping chamber. Softly, slowly. Each stroke of the stone felt like an act of rebellion. Not against his master but against the idea that he was replaceable, that he was temporary, that the line of Bane could pass through him without ever stopping. But by morning, the carving was gone, erased. His master had seen it. He didn't scold him. He didn't punish him. He simply whispered, A name without power is an invitation to be forgotten. The words followed Ramage for weeks. They echoed in every meditation. They slipped into every training exercise. And slowly he came to understand that his master was not trying to erase him. He was trying to prepare him. Power came first. Identity came after. But Ramage wanted both. He wanted to exist, truly exist. Not as a shadow under someone else's will. Not as a placeholder in a rule older than memory. Not as a vessel waiting to be emptied when the time came for the final test. He wanted to earn his name not through fear, but through endurance. His master began taking him off-world around this time. Small missions, silent ones, observations, extractions, disappearances. Nothing the Jedi would notice, nothing the galaxy would care about. But each journey showed him more of what he had never known. He saw the Outer Rim, where entire settlements struggled for water. He saw Republic worlds, where senators argued over credits instead of lives. He saw smugglers, mercenaries, and desperate families trying to survive under failing systems. He saw a galaxy too distracted to sense the last Sith who walked beside them. And he realized something frightening. If the Sith disappeared entirely, the galaxy would not look for them. It would not fear their return. It would simply continue. His master noticed the change in his eyes. "You see how little they care," he said. "This is why the Sith fell. Not because we were weak. Because we became irrelevant." Relevance. The word struck Ramage harder than any blade. The Sith had once been the center of galactic conflict. Now, they were a rumor fading in the dust. Ramage began to study not just Sith history, but the galaxy's perception of the dark side. He saw how time had rendered their greatest wars into myths. How Jedi teachings had smoothed the rough edges of truth. How the Sith were spoken of like creatures from forgotten nightmares. He felt a strange grief when he realized this. Not for himself, for them, for Bane, for Revan, for the ancient lords who had shaped entire rays, all reduced to cautionary tales. And somewhere inside that grief, Ramage found clarity. His name might never echo across the galaxy. His story might never shape worlds. But he would not vanish without meaning. He would become necessary even if no one ever knew he lived. Quietly, he accepted the truth the Force had whispered since his birth. Some Sith were born to lead empires. Some were born to destroy them. And some were born only to keep the fire alive long enough for someone else to see it. Ramage was the last kind. A keeper of embers. A shadow carrying a name the galaxy would never hear. But in the dark, that name still mattered, because he refused to let it die. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, silence was safer. Darth Ramage had a master, but there was no bond, no connection, no guiding hand. Only a figure made of precision and cruelty, a relic from a darker age, shaped by doctrines Ramage hadn't yet earned the right to understand. The man had no known name, at least not one he ever offered. Ramage was not permitted to ask. He was not permitted to rest. He was not even permitted to know the world they trained on. Only that it was cold, hidden, and full of echoes, a place where history had died screaming, and no one had come to bury it. His master wore a mask that covered half his face, not for anonymity, but to remind Ramage what pain looked like. The skin beneath it had been burned long ago, the price, he once said, of following a Sith Lord who failed the rule of two. That was his only story, and it was told once. Every other lesson was silent, delivered in glances, in traps, in impossible tasks. He was not taught with words. He was taught with consequence. When he hesitated, his rations were cut. When he asked questions, The oxygen in his chamber dropped. When he showed fear, the holocrons shut down for days at a time. There was no praise, only permission to try again. And always, always the master watched. Even in stillness, he felt like a blade. One that never moved, but was always ready to strike. And the moment Ramage thought he understood him, he was punished again. Because the lesson was not about understanding. It was about survival. One day, Ramage returned from a cave system where he had been left without direction. He had mapped every path, marked his return with precision, and arrived back ahead of the appointed time. He expected nothing, but for a moment, he felt pride. That night, his sleeping chamber was flooded with gas. Non-lethal, but enough to paralyze him for hours. When the numbness wore off, his master stood over him and whispered, "There is no reward for doing what you're told, only death for doing it too late." Every day was a reminder that efficiency was not the goal. Instinct was. That was how Sith were forged. Not by mastery of the Force, not by rituals or titles, but by sharpening pain into obedience, and then sharpening obedience into rage. His master never explained where he came from, but his knowledge betrayed the scars of a different time. He spoke of Korriban not as myth, but as a place he had bled on. He referred to Darth Bane as the last voice that mattered. He despised holocrons, called them echoes pretending to teach. He believed in control, not knowledge. He believed in silence, not philosophy. He believed in one thing, the unrelenting purity of purpose. And Ramage, young, quiet, half-starved Ramage, was that purpose. To him, the boy was not a student. He was an investment, a possibility, a weapon that might one day walk without command, but only if broken correctly. So he watched him stumble through training sequences designed for adult assassins. Watched him lift stones until his skin cracked open. Watched him stand barefoot on obsidian floors until his muscles gave out. Watched him bleed and fail and continue without asking why. Because the moment Ramage asked why, he would have to die. There was no room for a Sith who needed answers. And somewhere in that truth, Ramage began to shift. He didn't resist. He didn't rebel. He simply stopped imagining mercy. He stopped dreaming of kindness. He stopped wondering who his master had been before the mask. He stopped wishing for anything other than the power to outlive him. Because that was the lesson beneath every lesson. If you want to live, become the blade that watches. Ramage learned early that pain was not a test. It was a language. His master spoke it fluently, not through anger or outbursts, but through precision. Everything he did was controlled, calculated. Each punishment carried meaning, even when Ramage didn't understand it. And in time, he learned to read the silence between each blow. A cracked rib meant he hesitated. A dislocated shoulder meant he rushed. A cut across the forearm meant he relied too much on instinct. A burn across the palm meant he didn't rely on it enough. No lesson was ever spoken aloud. The body remembered what the mind was not allowed to forget. And so the scars began to map his childhood. They lined his arms like unfinished sentences. They curved across his back, like warnings written in a language older than fear. They marked his palms, his legs, his ribs, each one a reminder that survival required more than obedience. It required transformation. His master once dropped him into a ravine carved by centuries of acid rain. The stone was sharp, the smell suffocating, the climb impossible for anyone who hadn't already accepted the idea of losing skin to gain height. Ramage scaled the walls with bleeding fingertips, the ache building until he felt as if his bones were shivering. At the top, he expected instruction, a new task, maybe even acknowledgement. Instead, his master pushed him back down. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. When he climbed a second time, he didn't expect a reward. He didn't expect anything. And that was the point. Expectation was a weakness. Desire was a wound. The Sith trained for survival, not satisfaction. Ramage learned to extinguish both. There were nights he slept on stone so cold he couldn't feel his own breathing. Nights when darkness pressed so tightly against his chest that he wondered if the Force had abandoned him. But the Force never abandoned anyone. It simply waited. And in that waiting, Ramage found strength. His master introduced him to the lightsaber only when his hands had stopped shaking from exhaustion. The weapon wasn't a gift, it was a mirror, a reflection of everything he had endured. The blade hummed like a living thing, pacing around him as though it knew he was not yet worthy. He practiced until he could feel every vibration in the crystal, until he understood the difference between a strike made out of anger and a strike made out of purpose. The former was dangerous. The latter was deadly. When he failed, he bled. When he succeeded, he bled differently. Every lesson left a mark. Once, during a blindfolded training session, his master struck him across the face with the flat of a blade. Not enough to kill, but enough to tear skin and leave a long, thin scar beneath his eye. The cut never fully healed. His master never apologized. "Now your face remembers," he said. And it did. Ramage's mind became sharper than his weapon. He learned to anticipate movements before they were made. He learned to read the Force not as light or dark, but as pressure, the subtle shift of something unseen preparing to strike. But the greatest lesson came without a weapon. His master placed him in a chamber with no air for several minutes at a time. At first, Ramage panicked. The body fought for breath. The heart thrashed. The mind begged for release. But panic was weakness. Fear was noise. And noise led to death. So he adapted. He slowed his heartbeat. He embraced the stillness. He let the darkness enter him without resistance. When the door finally opened, he did not fall. He walked out on steady feet. His master watched him with something close to approval, not pride, but recognition. Ramage was no longer learning to survive pain. He was learning to become it. Victory was never celebrated. It was examined. Every success Ramage earned was treated like a flaw waiting to be exposed. His master did not want him confident. He wanted him aware, painfully aware, that every victory carried the seed of future failure. And so, each time Ramage succeeded, a new trial followed. Harder, sharper, crueler. The first time he defeated a training droid, he was 12. The droid fell in pieces at his feet, sparks curling through the dust like dying fireflies. For a heartbeat, Ramage felt something rise in his chest. Not pride, but relief. A small mercy, stolen from a life that rarely offered any. His master shattered it immediately. He unleashed 3 more droids, faster models, built for Sith assassins without warning. Ramage's muscles were still trembling, his breath still uneven, but there was no room to recover, no time to think. Only the instinct to avoid death. He fought until his palms split open, until the taste of iron filled his mouth, until the world narrowed into nothing but motion and pain. When he collapsed, the droid stood down, but his master did not. He stepped forward, studying the wreckage with the cold detachment of a surgeon. "You survived," he said. "Now learn why." There was no praise in his voice, only expectation. Ramage had to break down each movement, each strike, each mistake. He had to speak his failures aloud, even while struggling to breathe. And when he finished, the master nodded once. That is victory, not the killing, the understanding. It was the closest thing to approval he ever received. And even then, it felt like another warning. From that day on, Ramage fought differently. He no longer chased the moment of triumph. He studied it. He dissected it. He learned how to control the feeling before it had the chance to control him. He understood that victory meant the opponent had made a mistake. And mistakes were always waiting to be punished. His master introduced live targets soon after, small, swift creatures native to the abandoned moon they trained on. They were fast, unpredictable, and vicious. But Ramage learned their patterns. He learned patience. He learned to strike once, without hesitation. When he mastered them, the targets changed. Bigger, smarter, some even sensitive to the Force. One creature nearly killed him. A predator shaped like bone and shadow. It tore into his shoulder, crushing muscle, and leaving a wound that never fully healed. Ramage fought it for minutes that felt like hours, the creature's breath hot against his neck with every failed parry. He killed it not with strength, but with stillness. The moment the beast expected resistance, he stopped resisting. Its balance shifted, its guard opened, and Ramage drove his blade through its throat. He staggered back, covered in blood. That wasn't all the creatures. His knees shook, the world blurred. But the lesson was clear. When victory demands mercy, you give none. When survival requires silence, you make none. His master examined the wound on his shoulder, the torn fabric, the blood dripping through Ramage's fingers. He said nothing. He simply turned away, letting the boy walk back alone. Because suffering was not something to be corrected. It was something to be carried. Ramage learned to move through pain as if it were part of him. He learned to strike without emotion, to observe without judgment, to kill without hesitation. But he never killed for pleasure, only necessity. And that, more than anything, set him apart from the Sith who came before him. He did not crave death. He accepted it. He did not chase glory. He dismantled it. He did not ask what victory meant. He learned what it cost. And each cost brought him closer to the truth. His master refused to speak aloud. Mercy was not forbidden. It was irrelevant. The Sith do not speak of love, but they remember what it costs. Ramage didn't know the word when he was young. It had never been used in his presence. It didn't appear in holocrons. It was not carved into temple stones. And his master never spoke it. Not once. There was no place for it in the rule of two. No allowance for warmth, for closeness, for anything that softened the mind. Still, Ramage felt its absence. He didn't understand it until much later. But even as a child, he sensed the void around him. The cold, not just of stone and silence, but of something deeper, the kind of emptiness that comes from never being wanted. His master ensured it stayed that way. He offered no comfort, no protection, no moment of shared humanity. Not because he hated the boy, but because he feared him. Not as a threat, as a weakness. The same way one fears a crack forming in a blade long before it breaks. Ramage had learned obedience. He had endured punishment. He had mastered pain. But he had never been seen. And that was the truest test. Because a Sith who craves recognition is doomed. A Sith who needs connection will fail. So his master stripped it away before it could form. There were moments, though, strange, silent moments that lingered. One evening, after Ramage returned from a mission deep in the lower levels of a forgotten station, he found his rations doubled. No word, no gesture, just food. Enough to ease the aching in his ribs. Another time, after a training injury shattered part of his arm, he woke to find it healed faster than usual, treated while he was unconscious. Clean, precise. The acts were clinical, efficient, and yet, they felt deliberate. Not kindness, not affection, but something quieter, a hesitation. A flicker of what might have once been care, long buried beneath layers of Sith doctrine. Ramage never mentioned it. He never asked why. He only remembered. Because deep inside, beneath all the lessons, all the scars, all the rules, he still wanted to be seen. That was the part of himself he learned to hide. He buried it beneath control, beneath discipline, beneath the face he wore when speaking to his master, the mask of the Sith in training, the boy who felt nothing, the apprentice who needed nothing. But the Force never lied, and in the quiet, it whispered back what Ramage already knew. He was not hated, he was not feared, he was tolerated, until the day came that he would have to kill. That was the final truth of the rule of two. There is no love between master and apprentice, only preparation for betrayal. And yet, the ache remained. It followed him during meditations. It echoed in the halls of the empty compound. It clung to his thoughts when he tried to sleep, a wordless sorrow, not for what he had lost, but for what he had never been allowed to know. He began to realize something dangerous, something that could not be unlearned. If he ever loved, if he ever truly formed a bond, he would have to break it, or be broken by it. His master had never said those words. He didn't have to. He had lived them. And now, so would Ramage. In time, the lessons would harden. The ache would dull. The hunger for connection would be replaced by a deeper hunger for understanding, for control, for legacy. But some scars do not show. Some wounds do not bleed. And the most dangerous Sith are not those who hate. They are the ones who have forgotten how to love. He didn't wear a mask to hide. He wore it to remember. At 15, Darth Ramage crafted it himself, not of metal, not of armor, but of instinct. A face the galaxy would not question, a voice it would not challenge. A silence too measured to provoke curiosity. It wasn't for disguise. It was for survival. The fear inside him never left. But the mask made it invisible. His master never acknowledged the change. He didn't need to. The rule of two had no room for sentiment. But there was a flicker of something, a pause. A nod the day Ramage walked into the meditation hall with his new face. And from that day forward, he was treated less like a student, and more like a tool. The galaxy had begun to shift. Whispers of unrest in distant sectors, unseen movements in the core. Small, careful steps toward a future Ramage would never be allowed to control. But his master knew this much. The time for hiding was not over. Not yet. The Sith still had to move in shadow. So Ramage was sent into it. His first assignments were not battles. They were observations, reconnaissance, diplomacy in places where diplomacy had long since failed. Derelict colonies, abandoned mining moons, stations run by mercenaries too exhausted to remember who they once fought for. Ramage arrived alone, speaking little, offering less. He learned to listen without appearing interested, to move through spaceports like vapor, to leave no trail behind. No one ever saw his real face. No one ever asked, because the galaxy was tired, and tired people don't ask questions. It was in this quiet that Ramage first began to form his voice. Not the one he used to speak to locals or traders or dying governors. That voice was just part of the mask. A calm, forgettable tone. Careful words, designed to disappear as soon as they were heard. His true voice lived in the space between missions, in his reports, in his meditations, in the subtle tension that followed him like a second shadow. There, buried beneath his training, beneath the rule, beneath the weight of survival, something began to stir. He started to question what power looked like outside of doctrine. He saw slavers who ruled more effectively than some Sith Lords. He saw warlords who held loyalty not through fear, but through necessity. He saw traders who controlled entire sectors by understanding what people needed, not what they feared. And he realized something dangerous. Power did not always come from pain. It was a thought he couldn't speak, a truth he couldn't share. But he held on to it, quietly. He returned from each assignment a little colder, a little sharper. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who understood. That control wasn't about presence, it was about absence. The less people noticed him, the more they gave away. His master once asked, "What did they see when they looked at you?" Ramage answered without hesitation, "Nothing." The old Sith nodded. "Good. Let them keep seeing nothing, until it's too late." But Ramage saw everything. He saw corruption in the outer rim, rot in the core. He saw how the Republic had forgotten entire sectors, how Jedi were spoken of not as protectors, but as myths, how even the memory of the Sith was fading. And beneath his mask, he began to understand what he might become. Not a conqueror, not yet, but a witness. One who remembers what the galaxy refuses to. He no longer wore the mask out of fear. He wore it to focus, to listen, to wait, because someday, someone would need to speak the truth. And when that day came, Ramage would know how to make his voice heard. The Outer Rim never asked who he was. It never cared enough to. By the time Ramage reached his second year of field missions, he understood a truth his master had never spoken, but had always relied on. The Outer Rim was the perfect place for a Sith to disappear. Not because it was lawless, but because it was exhausted. Worlds once rich in promise now hung like broken lanterns across forgotten space. Colonies starved. Trade routes died. Mining towns cracked open and collapsed into dust. And the people, they stopped believing anything would save them. It wasn't fear that ruled the rim. It was indifference. Ramage traveled through it like a shadow. Silent, observing, never interfering unless commanded. He visited settlements where children scavenged for food among the rusted frames of ships that had once carried hope. He walked through markets where every voice sounded tired, every gesture cautious, every dream already buried. And through it all, no one saw him. A boy with a hood, a voice too soft to draw notice, a presence too calm to seem dangerous. He slipped through crowds like vapor, unnoticed even when he stood at someone's shoulder. He realized then how easy it would be for the Sith to rise again. Not through conquest, not through fire, but through quiet, through patience, through slipping into the spaces where the Republic had stopped looking. His master had sent him here for a reason. Not to learn about the Jedi, not to survey military positions, but to understand weakness, the kind that grows not from fear, but from neglect. One evening, on a failing station orbiting a red-brown world of cracked soil, Ramage watched a man barter for water with the last of his tools. The man's hands shook, his voice trembled, not because he was afraid, but because he had nothing left to lose. The seller didn't even look up. He didn't ask where the man came from, or what drove him to such desperation. He simply took the tools, handed over a half-filled canister, and waved him away. Ramage stood there, feeling something tighten inside his chest. It wasn't pity. Sith were not taught to pity. It wasn't anger. Anger requires belief. It was recognition. This was how the galaxy forgot itself. One small cruelty at a time. He carried these moments back to his master, speaking in simple, clear sentences. His reports were never emotional, never dramatic, only true. "The people are hungry," he said once, "and they no longer trust the Republic." "They never did," his master replied. "They no longer believe in the Jedi. They never should have." Ramage paused. "But they believe in nothing now." His master turned toward him, mask glinting in the faint red light. "And that, apprentice, is where power grows best, in the places where hope has died." Ramage didn't answer. He didn't need to, because traveling the rim had shown him more than suffering. It had shown him emptiness, the kind that could be filled by anyone with enough patience to wait for the right moment. He learned how to move through crowded ports without being tracked, how to navigate criminal factions without exposing intention, how to read the eyes of desperate men who would sell their loyalty for a scrap of certainty. The rim didn't care who he was, but it taught him who he could become. A presence unnoticed until it chose to be known. A voice unheard until it decided to speak. A shadow the galaxy would overlook, right up until the moment it couldn't. Ramage left each mission unchanged on the surface, his mask still steady, his voice still even. But inside, something had started to grow, not ambition, not yet, but a seed. A quiet belief that the Sith could return, not because of strength, but because no one was watching. Pain had taught him how to survive, but silence taught him how to see. Ramage had grown up beneath orders, bruises, and unspoken rules. Every lesson his master gave was carved in suffering, but suffering could only teach so much. In time, Ramage stopped flinching, stopped reacting, stopped breaking. His body remembered the patterns, and his mind knew the drills. But it was in the long stretches between missions, in the quiet, that something deeper began to take hold. He would sit in dark corners of broken ships, waiting for orders that never came. He would listen to the hum of dying power cells, to the way old metal creaked in systems no longer supported by the Republic. No one spoke to him. No one asked him why he was there. The universe didn't notice a boy dressed in rags, sitting perfectly still, but Ramage noticed everything. He watched the way people moved when they thought no one was watching. He listened to the tone of desperation hidden beneath everyday speech. He studied the silence between decisions, the moments when someone hesitated before choosing cruelty. And he began to understand that real power wasn't loud. It wasn't found in the scream of a lightsaber or the explosion of war. It lived in the pause before a command, in the breath someone took before telling a lie, in the way a senator blinked when asked a question too close to the truth. He learned to recognize fear that had no sound, to sense deceit that didn't reveal itself in words, to detect the tension of someone who didn't know they were being followed. His master called this stillness, but Ramage gave it no name. He just listened. One mission took him to a transport hub on a dying moon, a place where refugees and fugitives crossed paths without ever speaking. Ramage sat in the corner of a dim cargo hold, pretending to sleep, as a man and woman nearby argued in whispers. The woman was smuggling stolen medical supplies. The man had betrayed her to a local gang. Neither said the words aloud, but Ramage felt them, not through the Force, through stillness, through watching, through waiting. When the gang arrived an hour later, he was already gone. But he remembered the way the woman's fingers curled around the edge of a broken crate. Not in fear, in realization. Silence didn't just expose others. It revealed Ramage to himself. He began to notice what thoughts lived inside his own pauses, what questions returned when he stopped moving. What feelings refused to die in the dark? He didn't miss his master. He didn't long for approval. But he wondered just for a moment if all Sith experienced this stillness before the fall. Darth Bane had once meditated beneath the tombs of Korriban, letting the dark side wrap around him like a sea. Revan had walked alone through the unknown regions, guided only by silence and instinct. Even Malgus, brutal as he was, had paused at the edge of his final betrayal, as if waiting to hear something no one else could. Ramage didn't yet know what his own silence meant, but it frightened him more than pain ever had. Because pain was predictable, but silence made you face yourself. And in that quiet, he realized something cruel. He had no voice because no one had ever listened. Not his master, not the galaxy, not even the Force. He had spoken through obedience, through endurance, through survival, but never through choice. That, more than anything, began to change him. He didn't want to shout. He didn't want to command. He just wanted to be heard once, and to never be forgotten. And in that stillness, his voice began to form. He didn't plan to speak. It just happened. The mission was simple. Infiltrate a defunct communication outpost on a forgotten moon near the Atravis sector. His master's orders were clear: locate and extract the data core. Avoid detection. Leave no trace. But the outpost wasn't empty. Inside, he found a woman, alone, mid-40s, skin marked by sun and stress. Not military, not a threat. Just a technician, trying to hold together systems no one cared about anymore. She didn't reach for a weapon when she saw him. She didn't scream. She just looked up and said, "You're not supposed to be here." Neither was she. He could have killed her. That was the expectation. No witnesses, no exceptions. But he hesitated. Not out of mercy, not out of weakness, but because she wasn't afraid of him. She didn't see the Sith. She didn't see the blade. She saw a boy in a tattered cloak, standing too still for someone his age. He told himself to act, to end it before it became a memory. But then she asked, "What's your name?" He didn't know why he answered. He hadn't spoken his name aloud in years. "Ramage," he said. The sound startled him. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. The word filled the space, like it belonged there. Like it had been waiting all this time to escape. The woman didn't smile. She just nodded and returned to her work, as if the moment didn't matter. As if the galaxy wasn't shifting around them. He left without finishing the mission. Later, back in orbit, he erased the entire record of the moon from his ship's logs. He told his master the station had already been scavenged, its systems wiped, its core beyond recovery. The lie burned in his throat, but it also freed him. Because in that lie, he found his voice. It was quiet, but it was his. He began to speak more after that, never to strangers, never in the open, but in reports, in field journals, in fragments of truth, scattered like broken data, across untraceable channels. Words meant for no one, thoughts never sent. He told the stars what he had seen. He told the dark what he had learned. And for the first time, he told himself what he believed. The Sith were not gone, but they were wrong. Ramage wasn't meant to wait in the dark forever. He wasn't meant to follow the same path of murder and silence that had claimed every Sith before him. He wasn't meant to kill his master just to become the next mask in the chain. He was meant to remember, to witness, to carry the truth that others had buried beneath war and ritual, to speak it not with fire, but with precision, not with rage, but with understanding. Because the galaxy had forgotten the Sith, and the Sith had forgotten themselves. He didn't need to rebuild their empire. He didn't need to resurrect their wars. He just needed to speak their truth clearly, once, before it vanished. And so he began to write. Not a manifesto, not a threat, just thoughts, warnings, lessons carved in cold logic and quiet pain. He had no audience, but he had a voice born in silence, sharpened by pain, tempered by patience. And in the far corners of the galaxy, where no Jedi listened and no Sith remained, a whisper began to move through forgotten systems, not loud, not proud, but present. A single voice that carried all the weight of what had been lost. A voice that said, I was here, I learned, I endured, I remember, and, for now, that was enough. The day came quietly. No warning, no ritual, no spoken decree. Ramage woke in darkness, the same as every morning, but the air felt different, still, heavy. The kind of silence that follows a decision no one can unmake. His master stood waiting in the training hall, motionless, as if carved from the same stone that shaped the walls around them. There were no instructions. No pretense of a lesson, only the simple truth the rule of two had whispered since his childhood. One must die, one must rise. Ramage did not fear death. He feared failure, the kind that ended not with pain, but with being forgotten. His master had trained him for this moment since the day he learned to walk. Every scar, every breath held too long, every night spent in isolation, it all led here. He stepped into the center of the hall, the floor littered with ash from earlier drills. His master's mask glinted in the low red light, hiding a face that Ramage had never truly seen. Not clearly, not fully. And he realized then that the mask had never been a shield. It had always been a warning. A Sith does not live long enough to show their true face. The chamber sealed behind him with a hiss. His master spoke first, not with anger, not with ceremony, but with the cold finality of someone fulfilling a duty. You are strong enough to try, not strong enough to win, just strong enough to try. Ramage ignited his blade. A thin red line cut through the darkness, steady in his hands. His master did not ignite his own. Not yet. He simply watched, measuring Ramage the way a surgeon measures the depth of a wound before cutting deeper. Ramage moved first. A step, a strike. Precision sharpened through years of pain. His master blocked it without effort, shifting only enough to avoid the heat. No struggle, no force behind it. Just a reminder, you are not my equal. Again, Ramage attacked. Faster this time, more focused. He struck high, then low. Tried to break the guard, tried to force movement. But his master absorbed every blow, letting the impact roll off him, like wind, bending around a mountain. When he finally spoke, it wasn't mockery. It was truth. You fight like someone who wants to live. Ramage said nothing. Words were pointless now. His master ignited his blade. The sound filled the chamber like a verdict. Their sabers clashed, sparks scattering across the floor. Ramage felt the force of each blow drive through his arms, threatening to tear the bones from their joints. His master was not simply stronger, he was precise, experienced, designed for this moment in the same way Ramage had been shaped for it. But strength was not the only currency of survival. Ramage shifted tactics. He abandoned form, abandoned elegance, abandoned the idea of honor. He fought like someone raised in darkness, shaped by hunger, sharpened by silence. He fought with everything his childhood had carved into him: fear, instinct, and inevitability. And for the first time, his master stepped back. A small step, barely visible, but enough. enough to show that Ramage had struck not with skill, but with something far more dangerous: intention. This was not a duel. This was a murder. Ramage pressed forward, using the force of his own exhaustion to drive his blade harder. His master countered, redirected, punished. But Ramage no longer fought to win. He fought to end, to break the chain before it broke him. A misstep, a spark, a slip in defense. Ramage saw the opening. He drove his blade forward, not toward the heart, but toward the breathing mask. Metal screamed. Circuits burst. Flame erupted as the mask split apart, pouring fire across the master's face. His master fell without a sound, but the fire did not stop. It reached for Ramage, too hungry, wild, uncaring. It climbed his arm, burned through cloth, tore into skin. He dropped to one knee as pain thundered through him, the scent of scorched flesh filling the hall. Victory had come, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like loss, because the rule of two had taken another master and left Ramage alone. His master had always known how this would end. It wasn't a question of if only when. The rule of two was never meant to be a partnership. It was a countdown, a lesson with only one correct answer: death. But Ramage had never understood just how much of his master's life had been spent preparing to die. He had thought the man was invincible, cold, relentless, a figure cut from the ancient codes of Bane himself. But when the fire faded, when the silence returned to the chamber, Ramage saw something he hadn't expected. Not weakness, not surprise, readiness. The body lay crumpled, smoke rising from the mask now fused to melted skin. But the hands, they were open. Not in shock, in acceptance, like someone who had finally reached the end of a long sentence. His master had not fought to live. He had fought to complete his purpose. And now, that purpose had been passed on. The pain in Ramage's arm grew worse with every breath. Blistered skin clung to the scorched fabric of his robes. His left hand could no longer grip his weapon. His vision blurred around the edges. And, in the stillness, one truth burned brighter than the fire that had nearly taken him. His master had always expected to lose, not because Ramage was better, but because the rule demanded it. This wasn't evolution. It was erosion. One life ending to make room for another, without ceremony, without legacy, without name. He staggered back, trying to catch his breath. The chamber still reeked of heat and blood. The walls that had once held whispers of teachings now held nothing. The lesson was over. The teacher, gone. And yet, it didn't feel like victory. He thought there would be clarity. A moment of transformation. A shift in the force. But all he felt was pain in his body, in his thoughts, in the silence that followed. The man who had shaped his every breath, every scar, every discipline, was gone, just like that. And Ramage hadn't said a word to him. Not one. There had been no final question, no defiance, no acknowledgement. Just a blade, a flame, a fall. He looked down at the remains, unsure what to feel. There was no part of him that missed the man. But there was a part that wondered what, if anything, had been real. Had his master ever cared, even once? Had he seen Ramage as a student, or merely a replacement? These questions had no answers, because now there was no one left to give them. He turned away, not because he was ready, but because there was nothing else to do. He limped through the halls, past the empty quarters, past the sparring room where his blood still stained the floor. Every shadow now belonged to him. He was alone, but it was a different kind of solitude. One that came not from being forgotten but from becoming the only one who remembers. Ramage entered the meditation chamber and sat in silence. The pain flared in his side, sharp and deep. He ignored it. He had learned to ignore worse. He did not speak. He did not cry. He simply breathed. And in that breath, something changed. The Force did not celebrate him. It did not mark the moment. But it moved slowly, faintly, as if acknowledging a shift. Not a rise to power, but a continuation. He was now the master. But he felt no mastery. He was now the voice. But he had nothing left to say. He thought of the man who had trained him, a master without mercy, a weapon built to die. And for the first time, Ramage understood the cost of becoming Sith. You don't inherit strength. You inherit the silence that comes after it. The fire had done its work, but it had not shown mercy. Ramage's body would never be the same. The burns on his left side, wrapped from shoulder to hip, skin peeled, nerves exposed, muscle blistered in places. The med droid refused to treat fully. His fingers no longer closed properly. His left eye watered constantly, stung by heat damage that had melted part of his upper brow. But none of that was the worst of it. The worst was the smell. His own flesh charred, fused with fabric, and ash had a scent that clung to his mind, long after the pain had dulled. It returned during meditation. It returned in silence. It returned in dreams. It was the smell of victory, and it sickened him. He didn't scream when it happened. Not when the fire touched him. Not when his skin split. Not when he dropped to the ground gasping for breath. There was no time, no space for weakness. Only motion, survival, completion. But once it was over, the silence screamed for him. He spent the next days alone, hidden deep in the compound's recovery chamber. No healing tanks. No kolto. His master hadn't believed in them. Only raw endurance. The kind that left scars, not just as reminders, but as proof. He stared at the ceiling for hours, sometimes days, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. The Force pulsed around him like a heartbeat, distant, cold, unimpressed. The temple made no sound. No droid walked the halls. No protocol spoke the words, "Well done." Because the rule of two didn't reward you for surviving. It simply stopped trying to kill you. In the quiet, he remembered the old teachings. Bane's writings, Xana's trials, the fire of Korriban's tombs, the screams of the Brotherhood as they were devoured by the thought bomb. He remembered it all, and none of it felt like power. It felt like pain wrapped in ritual, legacy dressed in blood. And he began to ask himself the question no Sith was meant to ask. Was this the only way? He didn't know the answer, but he knew this. Fire wasn't cleansing. It didn't purify him. It didn't make him stronger. It just took something he would never get back, pieces of his body, of his youth, of his humanity. And in its place, it left a kind of emptiness. Not despair, not loss, just quiet. And the realization that the moment he became Sith, part of him died with the man he killed. He rose from the chamber after 7 days. Not because he was healed, but because he knew healing wasn't the point. He stood in front of the mirror, shirtless, and stared at the ruin of his skin. The burns reached over his ribs, twisting the shape of his shoulder. The mask he had once worn to hide his fear had melted in the fire. What remained was his true face, and it was unreadable. He didn't cover it. He didn't reach for robes or armor. He just stood there, letting the Force settle around him like cold water. This was his reward. To live, to remember, to carry pain with no promise of meaning. He left the mirror, left the chamber, left the remnants of who he had been. There were no words etched in stone, no temple to mark the death of his master, no ceremony for the rise of Darth Ramage. Only the burn, and the silence that followed it. He would go on, because that's what the rule demanded. But he would never forget that the fire had not lifted him. It had broken him, and in that breaking, he found the shape of who he would become. The wound closed, but the scar never healed. Ramage learned quickly that pain could fade, but memory did not. His body moved again, slowly at first, then with purpose. His burned skin pulled tight when he turned. His fingers ached when he gripped a hilt. His breath caught when cold air touched the ruined nerve endings near his ribs, but none of it stopped him. The body was just a vessel. That was what the Sith taught. What mattered was control, clarity, power. And yet, as Ramage stood alone, in the dark chamber that once belonged to his master, he felt something his teachings had never prepared him for. Grief. Not grief for the man he killed, not grief for what was lost, but grief for what had never been given. There had never been a bond, never a name spoken in kindness, never a single moment of peace. The man who trained him had shaped him with precision but not care. He had passed down fear like an inheritance. And now that inheritance was complete, Ramage was alone. The chain had been broken, and nothing stood between him and the future. He wandered the halls of the stronghold, retracing every lesson, every scar, every place where silence had spoken louder than words. He sat in the same stone seat where his master had once meditated. The walls were still scorched. The floor still bore the cracks from their last battle. But it felt smaller now, emptier, and that emptiness had a voice. It whispered questions. What comes after pain? What comes after victory? What comes after you've done everything you were told to do, and still feel like something's missing? He spent weeks in solitude, studying holocrons that once refused to open for him. Now, they responded not because he was ready, but because there was no one left to say he wasn't. He listened to the voices of long-dead Sith Lords, their warnings, their rage, their ambition. And the deeper he listened, the more he realized they all had one thing in common. They had all been alone. Ramage felt it in every phrase, every echo, every command carved into stone centuries ago. The Sith did not build legacies. They built graves. One by one, master after apprentice, they passed down knowledge like a disease, power earned through betrayal, control earned through loss. It was a cycle, and he had just become its next prisoner. He thought the fire would set him free. He thought the scar would remind him of what he'd survived. Instead, it reminded him of everything he had yet to become, because, now, he had no master to blame, no voice to follow, no shadow to hide behind. Every decision would be his, every mistake his to carry. Every scar he gave would lead back to this one, the one that marked the moment he stepped into the dark alone. He sealed the stronghold, left it buried in dust and memory. It had served its purpose. He took only what mattered, the blade, the knowledge, the silence, and the scar. He would wear it not with pride, but with understanding, because scars are not proof of power. They're proof of survival, and survival was not victory. It was just endurance. He stepped into the void of hyperspace, with no destination, no plan, no one waiting. The galaxy would not know his name. Not yet. It would not tremble. It would not care. But he had time. He had pain. He had a voice that had outlived the fire. And he had a scar that would never let him forget why he was still alive. Not to conquer, not to destroy, but to become the Sith no one remembered. Because the ones who are never remembered are the ones who never fail. She wasn't supposed to be there. The temple had been buried for centuries, hidden in the jagged canyons of a long-dead world. its halls swallowed by time and silence. Ramage came searching for relics, fragments of Sith knowledge, lost in the collapse of the old empires. He didn't expect life, and certainly not a child. She moved like smoke through the broken columns, small, quiet, eyes too old for her face. She didn't speak at first, just watched, like she'd been waiting. Ramage didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't know why. She wasn't force-sensitive in the traditional way. Not trained, not shaped. But the darkness around her bent unnaturally. It didn't threaten her. It followed. It listened. It clung to her presence like ash to scorched skin. She couldn't have been more than 10. He asked her name. She said nothing. He asked again. Still silence. But she didn't run. That was the first sign. She wasn't afraid of him. Not the mask, not the saber, not the voice. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. She was waiting. Waiting for someone who could hear what the Force had whispered since her birth. That she was not meant to live an ordinary life. That she was meant to destroy or be destroyed. Ramage should have walked away. The rule was clear. There could only be two, master and apprentice. No exceptions. And he had no master. That should have made her his replacement or his executioner. But she was too young, too raw, too fragile. She didn't know what she was yet. And something inside Ramage hesitated. He remembered being her. Not in form, but in feeling. The hunger for answers. The silence that defined your entire childhood. The instinct to hide, not because you were weak, but because you knew no one would come for you if you fell. So he stayed. He set up camp in the outer chamber. Didn't speak, didn't approach. Just let her watch him the way she had been watching the dark. And over time, she began to inch closer. First in the shadows, then at the edge of the firelight, then, finally, beside him. She asked for nothing. He offered nothing. But the force between them shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. But it moved. The same way it had moved the day he killed his master. The same way it moved in old temples when memory clung to stone. She didn't speak until the third day. Why do you burn? It was the only thing she said. And it was enough. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, he left a training beacon near the old dueling circle. Not activated, not explained, just placed where she would find it. And the next morning, she was there, holding it like it meant something. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it belonged to her now. And so the cycle began again. Not with thunder, not with power, but with quiet. A Sith teaching a child he should have left behind. He knew it was wrong. He knew the rule. He knew what it meant to break it. But she reminded him of something he had tried to forget. He had once been found too. And that had changed everything. He told himself it was just observation, just guidance, not training, not yet. But the Force doesn't listen to lies. It listens to intent. And Ramage's intent was already clear. He was going to break the rule. Not for legacy, not for power, but to try just once, to shape something that wouldn't end the way he had. He didn't say the word apprentice. Not to her, not to himself. But he stopped calling her the child. And that was the first fracture. It started with simple drills, motions in the dust, using a broken training pike. He never demonstrated directly. He just left patterns carved into the floor and waited to see if she understood. She did. Every time. Within days. She mimicked more than movement. She mirrored his silence, his restraint. She asked no questions. Not because she lacked curiosity, but because she was learning that questions rarely brought comfort. Ramage told himself it was temporary. She would move on, or he would. But neither happened. And the temple ancient, half collapsed, buried in forgotten soil, became their prison. And their refuge. He scavenged holocrons she could not yet open, gave her excerpts, echoes. He let her hear the voices of dead Sith carefully curated, edited, controlled. Nothing from Bane, nothing from Nihilus. Only fragments from lords who once whispered of focus, of shaping chaos. He taught her control, not ambition, discipline, not destruction, but even control is power, and even silence is seduction. The force around her began to stir, subtly at first flickering stones, tremors in shallow pools, but then more, heat in her footsteps, shadows that lingered too long, words she hadn't heard spoken aloud, returning to her in dreams. She never asked what was happening. She already knew, and that terrified him more than anything, because he wasn't building a tool. He was shaping a mirror. She moved the way he once moved. She hesitated in the same moments. She held her blade like it was a memory, not a weapon. And when she finally spoke again after weeks of silence, her voice was steady. "Why do the Jedi hate us?" Ramage stared at her for a long time, then answered, "They don't hate us. They fear what we remember." She nodded. Nothing more. He had broken the rule. Fully, irrevocably. And yet, there was no punishment. No bolt of force judgment from the void. No vision of Bane's wrath. Just quiet. The same quiet he'd lived in since killing his master. The same quiet that whispered maybe this was how the Sith should have changed. Not through blood, through remembrance. But memory doesn't protect. It only delays the blade. One morning, he awoke to find the child meditating alone in the inner sanctum. A place he had never shown her. A place sealed by scripts in old Sith. He hadn't even sensed her pass through. She was 10, maybe 11 now, and she had already gone where he wasn't ready to follow. That's when he knew. This wasn't safety. It wasn't guidance. It wasn't redemption. It was replication. And the rule of two had never truly died. It had just changed shape. Ramage left that night. Told himself he needed to scout, to gather supplies, to locate routes that would keep them hidden. But it wasn't about maps, or food, or enemies. He needed to breathe, to stand in the cold alone, to feel the scar on his chest pull beneath his tunic, to ask himself a question he had buried too deep for too long. Was he training her to save her? Or training her because he didn't know how to stop? The dark doesn't shout. It whispers. And when it whispered her name that night, he didn't stop it. Because he still believed, perhaps foolishly, that what he was building wouldn't end the way it always did. But the rule of two doesn't scream when it breaks. It breaks quietly. And by the time you hear it, it's already mended itself in someone else. There are lessons the Sith are meant to pass down, and then there are lessons they were meant to bury. Ramage taught her both. He told himself it was restraint, that he was showing her only what she needed to survive. No illusions, no rituals, just control, precision, awareness of the dark without surrender to it. But the truth was harder to face. He was teaching her the only way he knew. She learned quickly, too quickly. Where others would have faltered, she adapted. Where fear should have made her hesitate, she moved faster. When Ramage spoke of the Force, not as a tool, but as a storm waiting behind the breath, she nodded before he finished the thought. And when she finally spoke her own name, he felt something shift inside him. Not pride, not connection, fear. Because once you give a name to a shadow, it begins to want things. It begins to imagine a future. He gave her a saber hilt without a crystal, told her it was not earned through violence, but through clarity, that it would only bind to her when she understood her own purpose. He had stolen that teaching from a holocron, a fragment from an ancient Jedi who later fell to darkness. He never told her the source, because not all truths need to be spoken. Some are too heavy. He taught her how to build memory through pain, not by suffering, but by understanding the lesson behind it. He taught her how to walk through fire without thinking of heat, how to trust silence more than sound, how to listen for lies in what was never said. But he didn't teach her mercy, because no one had taught it to him. And without realizing it, he passed on the same scar he had sworn to silence. One night, she stood above the training circle, where he'd once buried a sensor net, the same trap his master had used on him. She triggered it on purpose, let it slice into her leg, didn't scream. When he found her, she was already treating the wound. He asked her why. She said, "You said pain teaches truth. I wanted to know if it lied." He had no answer. He realized then that she wasn't just learning his lessons, she was testing them, weighing them, deciding whether they would become hers or not. And that made her more dangerous than he expected. She wasn't following blindly. She was watching him, studying him. As he had once studied his master, he should have stopped, should have ended it before the path became inevitable. But each time he thought of leaving her, the silence returned, the one he had carried since boyhood, the one that wrapped around his mind like frost and whispered, "If you leave, she becomes you." And he couldn't let that happen, so he stayed and taught her things he shouldn't have. How to sense fear in a stranger's breath, how to cloak her thoughts without using the Force, how to mask darkness behind stillness, how to kill without needing to. These were not the teachings of a savior. They were the legacy of someone trying to rewrite the ending of a story already carved in stone. He didn't see himself as a master, but she did. And the way she looked at him now, not with reverence, but with recognition, told him something he wasn't ready to hear. She was beginning to wonder when he would become the thing she had to overcome. Because every Sith apprentice eventually learns the same unspoken truth. Not all lessons are meant to be taught. Some are only meant to be broken. He told himself she would be different. That if he taught her carefully, slowly, she might escape the pattern that had devoured every Sith before her. But the Force does not reward hope. It studies it, and waits to prove it wrong. She had grown stronger, not just in ability, but in presence. Her voice carried weight. Her silence drew attention. The Force around her no longer clung, it responded. When she entered the training circle, the air shifted, not because she demanded it, but because it already knew she belonged. Ramage began to lose control in ways he couldn't explain. Not openly. Not yet. She began finishing his sentences. She asked questions he wasn't ready to answer, not because they were too advanced, but because they were too close to the truth. She started to wonder why the Sith had always remained in hiding, why power was feared instead of wielded, why Ramage, if he truly believed in her, still held her back. And in the silence that followed those questions, she heard her future. She began speaking to the holocrons alone, entering locked chambers without assistance. She stood longer in the old sanctum, where the dark side flowed like breath. Sometimes Ramage would wake in the middle of the night and sense her nearby, not watching, not waiting, just there, as if she already knew how the story would end. He had trained her to think for herself. Now she was thinking without him. And though she never raised her voice, he felt the distance growing. One morning, she said something he never forgot. "You think I'll become you, but I think I already passed you." She didn't mean it as cruelty. There was no pride in her tone, just recognition, and that hurt more than any blade. Because he had given everything to keep her from becoming another weapon. He had broken the rule, endured exile, chosen silence, all to create a future where the apprentice didn't need to kill the master. But the rule of two is not a law. It's a gravity. And even when you fly from it, it pulls. He saw it in her eyes, now not anger, not betrayal, certainty. The same certainty he once carried into the chamber where his master had fallen. She didn't challenge him. Not yet. But the day was coming. He felt it, in every breath. The future he had tried to save was already choosing whether or not to save him. And Ramage wasn't ready. Not because he feared her, but because he didn't know if she was right. He had passed on everything. The discipline, the pain, the control. He had withheld nothing. And now he wondered if that was the mistake. Not breaking the rule but thinking he could break the pattern. He sat alone that night beneath the stars outside the temple. The wind carried dust over the broken stones, and the Force said nothing. But it didn't need to. He understood now what his master had known the night they fought. There comes a moment when the apprentice stops being yours, not because they reject you, but because they outgrow the reasons they needed you. She wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't hidden. She was the future. And whether she chose to carry his memory or erase it, Ramage knew he would have no say. Because the rule does not end in blood. It ends in silence. And she was already learning how to speak through it. He waited too long, and the galaxy forgot what it was supposed to fear. Ramage had always known that the Sith could not return through Force alone. War would only draw the Jedi. It would only trigger old alarms in systems still loyal to the myth of peace. So he stayed in the shadows, not to hide but to prepare, slowly, carefully. Like a knife sliding beneath armor, never touching flesh until it was too late. But the galaxy changed. It didn't sharpen. It dulled. The Republic was no longer what it had once been. Not ancient, not wise, not unified. It had grown slow, fractured, rooted in debate instead of strength. Its core worlds bloated on privilege. Its outer systems ignored. Senators became merchants. Jedi became symbols. And symbols were easier to dismiss than soldiers. Ramage should have seen opportunity. But what he saw was decay. He studied their council sessions, listened through silent transmitters buried in forgotten comm towers, followed the threads of power not through generals, but through mid-level bureaucrats who moved credits instead of fleets. They didn't speak in orders. They spoke in compromises. And yet, no one noticed the rot. The Jedi were still hailed as guardians. The Republic still waved its banner, but it was paper, thin, vulnerable, waiting to be torn by someone willing to strike hard enough. Ramage wasn't that person. Not yet. He began to send whispers, subtle provocations. He spread falsified reports to stoke fear in outer rim trade routes, arranged for messages to pass between criminal syndicates and political aides. Played both sides of disputes he never needed to win, only to escalate. He thought the galaxy would respond with panic, with caution, with alarm. It responded with silence. The Republic didn't react. The Jedi didn't act. They debated. They delayed. They waited for the danger to name itself. And when it didn't, they moved on. They didn't believe in the Sith anymore. And that was when Ramage realized the truth. The galaxy wasn't blind to darkness. It was bored with it. He wasn't a threat. He was a story, a warning passed down without belief, an echo from an age people didn't care to remember. To them, Sith Lords were as real as ancient monsters, dramatic, distant, dead. And in that indifference, Ramage felt something he had never expected: irrelevance. The Sith were not feared, because the galaxy no longer believed they mattered. It wasn't that the Republic had won. It was that the Sith had faded, not with fire, but with silence, and he had helped it happen. All those years in hiding, all that discipline, all the sacrifice made to preserve the line of Bane. And for what? A ghost trying to pull strings in a galaxy that no longer noticed when the lights dimmed. He still had power, still had knowledge, still had his apprentice, sharpening in the dark behind him. But his war was not a war of sabers and fleets. It was a war of memory. And memory was losing. He watched the HoloNet from a dark chamber on a forgotten station, saw young senators laugh at the myths of Sith temples, saw Jedi masters speak of balance without understanding what balance was forged from, saw crime syndicates rise, not through power, but through exhaustion, because people no longer cared who ruled, only that someone did. Ramage did not rage. He did not scream. He simply understood. The galaxy had not moved past the Sith. It had outgrown them, and he was watching the future unfold without him. Ramage learned that influence was not taken with a blade. It was taken with a whisper. So he became one. He drifted through political circles like a rumor no one remembered starting. Senators who never met him felt the weight of his suggestions without knowing why. A vote shifted here, a treaty stalled there, a supply route accidentally redirected. He planted ideas the way a gardener plants seeds quietly, trusting that they would grow in the minds of people too distracted to notice the soil changing beneath them. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to remind the galaxy what power felt like. But power requires someone willing to fear it. And fear was dying. On Coruscant, he slipped into the archives, disguised as a merchant's aide. The city world glowed with arrogance. Towers soared above clouds that no longer touched the ground. People walked past him without a glance. His presence meant nothing. His footsteps carried no echo. The Sith used to stop crowds. Now, he couldn't even stop a conversation. He searched for cracks in the Senate, men and women desperate enough to listen to a stranger with soft words and sharper intentions. He found many. Corruption had wrapped its fingers around the Republic long before he arrived. But corruption wasn't what he needed. He needed ambition. Real ambition, the kind that would break a system, not feed off it. Yet every senator he observed was the same. Hungry for comfort, not power. Hungry for re-election, not revolution. They wanted stability so badly that they mistook stagnation for peace. Ramage whispered into their doubts anyway. He suggested harsher trade restrictions. He planted forged intelligence that hinted at separatist movements years before the galaxy truly fractured. He manipulated border world leaders into distrusting the core. He even influenced a Jedi envoy to withdraw from a crucial negotiation by nudging the Force just enough to cloud their judgment. And still, nothing changed. The galaxy didn't ignite. It didn't tremble. It didn't even notice. His whispers landed on ears too numb to hear them. The dark side coiled around him in frustration. But even the darkness felt different now, not eager, not hungry, just patient, as if wondering whether he still deserved to be its vessel. He tried again. He traveled to the mid-rim, offering subtle guidance to militia leaders preparing for conflicts the Republic pretended did not exist. He manipulated black market channels used by smugglers and pirates, hoping to destabilize fragile supply lines. He even incited a small uprising on a remote moon by influencing the dreams of its ruling council. But uprisings fizzled. Smugglers ignored him. Militia leaders lost interest. The galaxy was tired, too tired to rebel, too tired to fear, too tired to listen to a shadow offering power it no longer believed in. And for the first time in his life, Ramage felt the Force resist him. Not because he was weak, because the galaxy had shifted around him, like a door closing softly while he stood inside the frame. He was pushing against history, and history had already chosen another path. One night, in a dim sublevel beneath the Senate dome, Ramage watched a hologram of the Chancellor deliver a speech about unity. The words were empty, the applause was polite, and yet it worked. It calmed people, not because it inspired them, but because it distracted them. The Sith used to rule through terror. The Republic now ruled through noise. And noise was harder to silence than fear. He realized then that he was not a shadow behind the curtain. He was a shadow behind a shadow, unseen, unheard, unneeded. And the curtain was already closing. He had spent his life preparing for a return that never came. Not the return of armies, not banners or wars, but the return of the Sith as a force the galaxy would once again have to reckon with. And he believed, for far too long, that he would be the one to make it happen. But now, Ramage wandered from system to system like a ghost looking for something he could no longer name. There were no temples to rebuild, no alliances to forge. The old ways had become warnings. The rule of two, a whisper no one feared anymore. The galaxy had evolved, and the Sith had not. He thought once that patience would be his weapon, that time would bend toward those who endured. But time had moved on without him, and every effort he made to pull the galaxy back into the shadow only proved one thing. No one was looking for it anymore. The Jedi weren't hunting him, because they didn't know he existed. The Republic wasn't resisting him, because they didn't notice he was near. He was a Sith Lord, fully trained, fully armed, fully alone. And still, the galaxy turned as if he were already dead. He tried to create symbols, left encrypted messages in ancient Sith dialects on forgotten satellites, constructed ruins that looked like they had been attacked by dark side rituals, even triggered ancient distress signals designed to awaken fears buried in history. No one investigated. No one remembered. The Jedi archives contained entire sections marked myth, whole wars reduced to rumor, entire Sith doctrines labeled uncertain or legend. And worst of all, there were no more believers, not even among the lost. He once found a cult on an outer rim moon who worshipped the Force through pain. They spoke of darkness, of ancient wars. Ramage revealed himself to them just enough to see if they recognized the old teachings. They bowed, they called him master, but they asked for miracles, not discipline. They wanted spectacle, not legacy, so he left them in silence. Because if the Sith returned through performance, it would not be a return at all. It would be theater. The galaxy did not need another false god. It needed someone who remembered how truth felt when it cut. He sat alone on the bridge of a stolen vessel drifting near the edge of wild space. The stars stretched like veins around him. He no longer knew where he was going. His apprentice was gone, vanished into her own path, the rule now echoing through her decisions instead of his. And he realized the thing he had refused to admit. The Sith were not waiting to return. They were already gone. Gone not in body, but in relevance. He could survive another decade, maybe more, but it wouldn't matter. because his voice, the one he had shaped in fire and solitude, would not carry beyond the vacuum of his own making. The galaxy didn't kill the Sith. It simply forgot why they mattered. And Ramage was the last one who remembered. He closed his eyes in the dark, letting the hum of hyperspace drift around him. His hands, scarred and steady, rested on the console. He no longer reached for weapons, no longer searched for maps, no longer sent messages. He just waited, not for a sign, for silence, and in that silence he understood. The return he had prepared for was never coming, because the future wasn't looking for monsters. It was too busy forgetting they ever existed. He had outlived his time. He felt it in every breath. Ramage once believed the Force would guide him toward a future shaped by the Sith. A future where his voice, his teachings, his scars would matter. But the galaxy was no longer moving toward darkness or light. It was drifting, sliding into a future that had no place for him, no shadow carved in his shape. He wasn't fading because he was weak. He was fading because he no longer belonged. He walked through spaceports where Jedi once would have sensed him instantly. Now, they barely glanced his way. Their senses were dull, their urgency muted. They treated the Force like a philosophy, not a blade. He was a storm standing in front of them, and they felt only wind. The dark side responded to him still but faintly, like an echo bouncing through the wrong century. On a nameless world in the mid-rim, he watched a group of younglings play with makeshift lightsabers carved from scrap metal. They swung them with joy, not fear. One pretended to be a Sith Knight, a creature of bedtime stories, not of history. Ramage felt something twist inside him. He wasn't a warning anymore. He was a fable. He moved through the crowd, unseen, unheard. People brushed past him without pause. They didn't feel the cold around him. They didn't sense the danger. They felt nothing. And that nothing cut deeper than any blade. He traveled then to places where the Sith had once risen. Korriban, Dromund Kaas, Malachor, worlds soaked in hate and memory. But even they felt different now, quieter. As if the galaxy itself had begun to close its wounds. On Korriban, the tombs no longer whispered to him. They listened instead, as if waiting for him to say goodbye. He traced the cracked stones, remembering the weight of all those who came before him. Bane, Zana, Cognos, Plagueis, names that once shaped the galaxy, now forgotten by the very people they had tried to rule. He was supposed to continue that lineage. Instead, he was watching it rot from within. On Dromund Kaas, lightning storms that once screamed with the voice of the Force now murmured like dying embers. The temples stood hollow, statues crumbled. The air tasted thin, like power diluted across too many lifetimes. Even the darkness felt tired. He descended into an abandoned Sith archive and activated a holocron at its core. The red glow flickered weakly across his face. A long-dead master spoke of conquest, fear, destiny. Ramage listened, and felt nothing. Those teachings were forged for a galaxy that no longer existed, for enemies long gone, for wars the future had outgrown. He turned away, leaving the holocron to dim on its pedestal. There was no point in keeping it alive. It was speaking to an empty era. He left the planet with heavy steps, each one sinking deeper into the truth he had resisted for years. He was not failing the Sith. The Sith had already failed him. They had given him purpose with no path, a rule with no relevance, a legacy with no audience. He had survived everything, the fire, the scars, the solitude, only to discover that the world he was meant to reshape had already reshaped itself without him. He stood at the edge of a cliff on a barren world, watching the horizon burn gold beneath a setting sun. His cloak snapped in the wind. His scars ached under the cold. The force flowed around him in a slow, indifferent tide. He whispered to it, "You chose the wrong time for me." The force did not answer. He wasn't meant for this future. He wasn't meant to rebuild an empire. He wasn't meant to be feared or remembered or followed. He was meant to carry the last spark of a dying order into a galaxy that had already forgotten the fire. Ramage closed his eyes, letting the wind swallow him. He was not dead. He was not defeated. He was simply fading into the wrong future. He felt it before he understood it. A shift in the force, subtle at first, then sharp, like a breath pulled from his lungs by a hand he could not see. Darkness was moving again. Not his darkness. Not the patient, silent discipline he had carried through decades of obscurity. This was something larger, hungrier, woven into currents he no longer recognized. Ramage stood at the edge of a deep-core outpost, a forgotten fragment of a forgotten age. The stars here were dim, half-choked by clouds of radiation and ancient debris. Few ships passed this region. Fewer still survived it. And that was why he stayed hidden inside the galaxy's blind spot. Yet even here, the force trembled. Someone was rising. He closed his eyes and let the darkness spread through him like cold water. It carried images he didn't expect: a hooded figure, a voice whispering promises, a plan unfolding through patience older than war. It wasn't his presence that shook the galaxy. It was someone else's. He tried to follow the vision, to trace the ripples back to their source. But the deeper he reached, the more the force recoiled, not rejecting him, but bypassing him, sliding past his mind as if he were no longer part of the path it had chosen. For the first time in years, Ramage felt small. The Sith were returning, but not through him. He searched the currents of the dark side again. Slower this time. He saw the Senate, the Jedi Temple, a masked warrior built not from fire, but from careful manipulation. A shadow wearing the face of a politician. A man whose patience made Ramage's look like a child's attempt at meditation. Darth Sidious. The name whispered through the dark, not as prophecy, but as inevitability. He had never met this Sith. Never felt his presence before now. But the Force did not lie. It carried Sidious's rise like a storm rolling across a forgotten sea, steady, unstoppable, claiming territory Ramage once believed would belong to him. He pressed a trembling hand against the cold metal wall beside him. Not from fear, from understanding. All his life, he had trained for a return that was never his. Prepared for a war he would never lead. Preserved knowledge no one asked him to guard. And now, in the twilight of his relevance, he watched another Sith complete the design he had once sworn to inherit. Ramage did not scream. He did not rage. He simply listened. The Force carried the shape of Sidious's mind like a distant drum. Plans within plans. A future sculpted through deception, not through fire. The Sith Lord's presence was a vortex, quiet, controlled, perfect. There was no waste, no hesitation, no doubt. Ramage felt the difference immediately. Sidious was not a survivor of the old ways. He was their evolution. Everything Ramage had clung to: the discipline, the silence, the sacred burden of the rule felt primitive by comparison. Sidious was bending the galaxy without ever drawing a blade, turning senators into soldiers, turning peace into a weapon. This was the Sith the galaxy still feared. Not him. Never him. A cold wind moved through the outpost, carrying dust over Ramage's boots. He watched it swirl, watched it scatter, watched it vanish into cracks in the floor. That was what he had become. Dust carried by a wind too strong to resist. He sat on the edge of a collapsed platform and stared into the void of space. The force pulsed with Sidious's growing power, steady, rhythmic, inevitable. Ramage knew he could not stop it, knew he could not join it, knew he could not even reveal himself without being swept aside. He had been preparing for a galaxy that needed him. But the galaxy had chosen someone else. And as he felt the first tremors of the Clone Wars beginning to take shape, Ramage understood the truth with quiet, devastating clarity. The darkness had risen again. It simply did not rise for him. He had always believed the Sith would return in fire. He imagined armies rising from forgotten worlds, holocrons awakening in ancient tombs, and the rule of two echoing through the galaxy like a long-buried scream finally breaking free. But that was not how Darth Sidious rose. There was no fire, no storm, no moment of terror announcing the return of the Sith. He rose quietly through influence, not dominance, through patience sharper than any blade Ramage had ever held, through a mask so flawless that the Jedi bowed to it. Ramage watched from the deep core as Sidious's shadow spread across the Senate. He felt the dark side flow into the heart of Coruscant, not like an invasion, but like a secret. Sidious did not conquer the Republic. He infected it. Every whisper Ramage had ever attempted, Sidious amplified. Every weakness Ramage had ever noticed, Sidious exploited. Every flaw in the Jedi he had quietly observed, Sidious turned into a weapon. It was mastery Ramage had never achieved, not because he lacked skill, but because the galaxy had never listened to him. It listened to Sidious. Ramage monitored transmissions stolen from diplomatic channels. He watched the Trade Federation shift allegiance without resistance. He watched entire star systems lean toward separatist rhetoric crafted by a Sith Lord who never needed to reveal his hand. It was genius. It was horrifying. And worst of all, it was everything Ramage had once dreamed of doing. He felt the weight of failure settle in his bones like cold mist, not because he envied Sidious's power, but because Sidious made the Sith relevant again without acknowledging the legacy Ramage had spent his life protecting. Bane's teachings, Xana's survival, Cognus's patience, all of it led to Sidious, not to him. Ramage wasn't the future of the Sith. He was the discarded branch of a tree that had grown without him. He tried to study Sidious more closely, reaching through the Force in careful strands. But Sidious's mind was a fortress layered, hidden, wrapped in a darkness so deep. Ramage felt it swallow his senses each time he listened too closely. This was a Sith who had never hesitated, never doubted, never broken the rule. And that was where Ramage saw the greatest difference. Sidious had never carried an apprentice he wasn't prepared to lose. Sidious had never questioned the cycle. Sidious had never tried to save someone from becoming him. He had embraced the rule without apology. Ramage had fought it every step of the way. Perhaps that was why the Force had passed over him. Perhaps that was why history had chosen another. He watched the first threads of the Clone Wars form not in violence, but in fear. Systems withdrawing, allies dissolving, armies quietly built. Sidious orchestrated both sides so perfectly that Ramage could not decide which was more terrifying, the brilliance of the plan or the simplicity of the deception. Ramage felt the galaxy tightening around this new Sith Lord like a snare waiting to spring, and he felt himself drifting farther from relevance with every move Sidious made. He wasn't part of this design. He wasn't even a threat to it. He was a relic watching a masterpiece forged from truths he once believed mattered. One night, as he traced star charts showing the spread of separatist influence, the Force carried a single whisper to him, faint, almost mocking. This is how the Sith return. Not through secrets, not through patience, through someone bold enough to reshape the galaxy, and ruthless enough to never question if it should be saved. Ramage stood alone in the darkened chamber, the glow of tactical projections washing over his scarred face. He finally understood. Another Sith had risen, and he was rising over Ramage's grave. Ramage once believed that survival was enough. That if he endured, if he outlasted his enemies, if he preserved the rule through silence, he would one day be remembered. But he wasn't. The galaxy didn't hate him. It didn't hunt him. It simply forgot. He had outlived his master, his purpose, his influence. He had trained in darkness, whispered into shadows, and moved through the galaxy as carefully as any Sith before him. But no one spoke his name. No one feared the idea of his return. No one even wondered if another Sith had been watching while Sidious rose. He wasn't hidden. He was gone. The Jedi never searched for him. Even as the Clone Wars burned through star systems, even as darkness fell like a curtain across the galaxy, not a single Jedi sensed him, not in the Force, not in their dreams, not in the silence between battles. He was a ghost in a galaxy too loud to hear him. He watched Sidious unfold his plan with perfect clarity. The war, the politics, the manipulation. He saw Anakin Skywalker drawn into the net, saw the Jedi Council unravel, saw the pieces fall exactly as Bane had envisioned, but with none of the reverence Bane had demanded. Sidious never spoke of the rule. He never named the past. He used the Sith as a tool, not as a legacy, and Ramage felt that cut deeper than exile. He had once believed he was a bridge between eras. Now, he realized he was a dead end. He tried once to leave a mark. He traveled to a world on the edge of the expansion region, where forgotten Sith ruins lay buried beneath jungle and stone. He carved his name into a black obsidian monolith, not in arrogance, not for power, but to be remembered. But by morning, it was gone. The jungle had reclaimed it. The stone collapsed. The Force itself seemed to erase the mark before it could linger. The galaxy didn't want to remember him. It wanted to move on. He returned to his station in the deep core and sat in silence for days. No movement, no messages. Just the soft hum of systems keeping him alive while the rest of the galaxy burned. And no one came looking. Not his apprentice. Not the Jedi. Not the Sith. He wasn't feared. He wasn't hunted. He wasn't needed. He was alone. And in that loneliness, he saw the truth that had eluded him for decades. Legacy was not earned through survival. It was earned through impact. And Ramage had made none. He had killed his master, as the rule demanded. He had trained an apprentice, as the cycle required. He had preserved knowledge, waited in silence, and watched the galaxy for a sign. But the sign had passed him by, and now he was watching history unfold without a single trace of himself inside it. He stood before a mirror aboard his ship and stared into his own face. The scars, the burn, the wear etched into his eyes. A mask that had long since become skin. And it meant nothing. He wasn't a Sith Lord. He wasn't a failure. He was just forgotten. And the most terrifying part wasn't the silence. It was the peace. Because he had become exactly what the galaxy had made him. A ghost no one remembers. He once believed legacy was a choice. That if he lived with discipline, if he preserved the rule, if he endured long enough, history would recognize what he'd carried. But history did not care. Darth Sidious had claimed the future. He had rewritten the path of the Sith without ever speaking the names of those who shaped it. He didn't mention Bane. He didn't preserve the code. He didn't continue the rule of two. He used it, then buried it. Ramage had spent his life guarding something sacred. Now, that sacred truth was being bent into a lie, so convincing the galaxy would forget it ever had another shape. The Sith had returned, but not as Ramage had envisioned. Not as heirs, as usurpers. He watched the rise of Darth Vader from a cold chamber buried in the deep core. He felt the moment Anakin fell not as a cry, but as a wound opening across the Force. It was powerful, immediate, violent. It was the kind of turn the old Sith feared. Because it wasn't forged through study. It was born from pain. Sidious had molded Vader in days. Ramage had spent years shaping a single apprentice only for her to vanish into the shadows before she ever claimed a name. He had followed the teachings and been left behind by them. He thought of the archives he had hidden, the holocrons he had repaired, the rituals he had preserved in fragments across dying worlds. None of them would matter now. The new Sith had no use for them. They didn't need philosophy. They needed weapons. And Ramage was not a weapon anymore. He tried, once more, to speak through the Force, to reach out across the void to anyone who might listen. Not Sidious, not Vader, but someone, anyone, a lost student, a survivor, a voice willing to remember the foundation beneath the empire that now rose without acknowledgement. But the Force answered only with silence. He wasn't just forgotten. He had been overwritten. His legacy, the legacy of Bane, of survival, of patience, had been stolen not by war but by momentum, by a new age that had no need for old architects. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to destroy what he had saved. The records, the codes, the ancient symbols etched in stone and blood, they still mattered. Not to the Empire, not to the Jedi, but to the Force itself. Because one day, the cycle would break again. One day, the Empire would fall, and someone would come looking. Not for Sidious, not for Vader, but for the pieces they left untouched. For the shadows beneath the shadow. Ramage walked through the final vault he had kept sealed, a place where the last of his knowledge slept in stasis. He activated the failsafe, embedding the coordinates inside a dormant crystal buried in an asteroid field near the unknown regions. He didn't leave a name. He didn't need to. This was not a monument. It was a memory, buried for whoever came next. And then, in the dark, he powered down his ship. No destination, no exit, no need to move. He stared into the void and whispered to the stars, "You stole my future, but not my truth." And the Force, cold, quiet, vast, whispered nothing in return. Because Ramage's legacy wasn't destroyed. It was waiting. Waiting beneath the empire that never knew his name. Waiting beneath the galaxy that never feared him. Waiting in silence for the day someone remembered what was lost. He was not the Sith who conquered. He was the Sith the Force forgot to bury. She never asked to be saved. He just assumed she needed it. Ramage told himself he had broken the rule for a reason, to preserve the Sith without repeating their mistakes. To shape a future that didn't end with betrayal, as it always had. To create something new. But from the beginning, he had trained her like they had trained him. He told her to listen, and she obeyed. He told her to wait, and she did. He told her to feel the Force through pain, through patience, through quiet, and she learned. But what he never told her was why. He never explained the loneliness behind his methods. He never showed her the cost of obedience. He never admitted that he was afraid she would become what he had tried to forget. So instead, he taught her everything. how to hide herself in the Force, how to kill with silence, how to speak with precision, how to listen when others only hear. She mirrored him perfectly, too perfectly. By the time she was a teenager, her presence in the Force was like his quiet, sharp, unreadable. She no longer asked questions, she no longer sought praise. She simply watched, absorbed, calculated. He thought she was becoming strong. But strength without understanding is only delay. And somewhere along the way, she stopped needing him. He sensed the moment it began to shift. She grew more curious about the galaxy, asked about the Jedi, not to learn but to assess. She stopped meditating with him, stopped waiting for instruction. Her training continued, but it was no longer shared. It was practiced behind closed doors. She was preparing for something. He just refused to see what. He found her one night in the central chamber of the old Sith refuge, studying an ancient relic, one he had never shown her. A cracked obsidian triangle etched with forgotten teachings. She had bypassed the locks without alerting him. When he asked how she found it, she smiled. "You left the path open. I just followed it." Ramage nodded, said nothing, but the weight of the words landed harder than any blade. Because she was right. He had shown her the path, the same one his master had once forced him to walk. Only this time, it wasn't forced. It was offered, and she had taken it willingly. He began to wonder what he had truly given her. Not wisdom, not discipline, not clarity. He had given her a question. Can the Sith be more than betrayal? And in her silence, in her distance, in her growing certainty, he began to feel her answer forming. One night, she didn't return. He searched the compound, waited, reached out through the Force. Nothing. When she came back days later, she didn't explain where she had been. She only said, "You taught me to survive." So I did. He didn't ask again, but the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like a bond. It felt like a pause before a decision. He thought of ending it. Thought of walking away. Thought of confronting her with all the things he never said about fear, about the rule, about what it meant to trust someone not to kill you. But he didn't, because deep down, he still hoped that she would choose him, that she would see a different path. And that hope, quiet, fragile, dangerous, was the final lesson he never meant to teach her. Because in the end, it was the one she would betray. She didn't strike in anger. There was no rage, no shouting, no trembling of the Force. Just movement, clean, deliberate, final. He barely sensed it coming. Not because she was faster than him, but because part of him had always expected it. She waited until he was vulnerable, unarmed, unready, not asleep, just unaware. She didn't need to overpower him. She only needed to step into the space he had spent years giving her. And then, the blade, red, precise, straight through the side, not deep enough to kill, just deep enough to say, "I've chosen." He staggered backward, pain blooming across old scar tissue, blood rising in his throat. She didn't press the attack, didn't finish it, didn't scream her intentions. She just stood there, holding the weapon he had helped her build. The hilt was one of his designs based on an ancient Sith artifact from the days of the Brotherhood. Modified, smoothed, refined, a blade forged by his own hand. She said nothing, neither did he. The silence between them was older than the betrayal. It had started the moment he trained her in secret, the moment he showed her the rule, but asked her to rewrite it. The moment he gave her power and asked her to be better than the one who gave it. But she hadn't become better. She had become him. And now she was standing where he once stood, blade in hand, master bleeding, the rule whispering what must come next. But she didn't kill him. She turned her back instead, stepped away, vanished into the compound's shadows like a memory unraveling. She could have ended it. She didn't. And somehow, that hurt more. He collapsed onto the floor, pressing his hand against the wound. It wasn't mortal. Not yet. But it would scar. Another mark. Another moment etched into skin to remind him what legacy really meant. He had trained her well. Too well. She had waited until she understood what she was and what he wasn't. She didn't want to be his apprentice anymore. She didn't want to wait for the galaxy to remember them. She wanted something else. Something faster, louder. Hers. He had given her tools, but not restraint. He had taught her power, but not patience. He had built a blade and asked it to spare him. And in doing so, he'd made the same mistake every Sith before him had made. He thought she could be different. He pulled himself to his feet, blood trailing behind him. The Force steadied him not with strength, but with habit. Pain had always been his rhythm. This was no different. Another lesson. Another scar. He found the training hall empty. The dueling circle, where she once stood waiting for instruction, now stood cold and still. He walked past the altar where her kyber crystal had first ignited. Past the chamber where she once whispered questions in the dark, thinking he couldn't hear. Every corner held a memory, and every memory whispered the same truth. You made her strong enough to leave. He returned to the communications console, locked it, disabled the outbound systems. She would not come back. Not because she was lost, but because she had made her choice. And he had given her every reason to make it. He leaned against the wall and let the pain settle into him. It would heal. Eventually. It always did. But this time, it wasn't just the body that was bleeding. It was the belief. The one hope he had held onto longer than any code, any rule, any ritual. That this time, the ending might be different. But the blade in his side said otherwise. He didn't chase her. There was no point. The galaxy was already calling to her in ways it never called to him. She wanted motion, opportunity, a place in the unfolding war that Ramage had watched from a distance for too long. She would find it, because she knew how to listen for power, and how to claim it when it spoke. But what she left behind was worse than betrayal. She left silence. Not the quiet Ramage had learned to master. Not the stillness of deep meditation or hidden truths. This silence was hollow. It was absence. It was failure echoing through empty halls. It was a broken future that didn't even shatter loud enough to mourn. He walked through the chambers they once shared, one teacher, one student, and felt the air shift in subtle ways. The presence she left behind still clung to the walls like vapor. But it wasn't dark, it wasn't light. It was undecided. She hadn't turned against him because he was weak. She had turned because he had nothing left to offer. And that truth wrapped around his chest like iron. He moved with care, tending to the wound in his side, cleaning up the training rooms, sealing off access points she once used freely. Not because he wanted to protect himself, but because routine was all he had left. He stopped speaking aloud. There was no one to hear. He stopped meditating. The Force had already said what it needed to say. He stopped writing. The archive was already full of words no one would read. Days passed, then weeks. He tracked the war from a distance. Sidious was winning. The Republic was dying in stages. The Jedi were unraveling. The galaxy was reshaping itself exactly as he had once hoped it would. Only now, he had no part in it. She didn't send a message, didn't leave a sign, didn't look back, and he never reached for her. Because the betrayal wasn't the blade. It was the silence that came after. The silence that told him she hadn't misunderstood the teachings. She had understood them too well. He remembered the first time she disobeyed an order not out of anger, but to test his reaction. He had rewarded her for it. Told himself it was a sign of strength. Now he saw it for what it was. A question she had answered on her own terms. Can I leave him behind? The answer had always been yes. He stood alone on the roof of the stronghold, the sky above heavy with ash from distant systems. War was spreading like fire, but none of it reached him. He watched stars flicker, ships pass, signals shift. And in the stillness, he listened for anything. A whisper, a regret, a voice calling back. But the silence remained. It wrapped around him like a reminder that legacy was not forged by survival, or training, or sacrifice. It was forged in the memory of those who carry your name forward. And she had left his name behind. She would rise in the galaxy. That much he knew. Maybe as a Sith, maybe as something worse. But she would not speak of him. She would not say where she learned. She would not honor the scar she left in his side. And that was the end of their story. Not a final battle. Not a duel beneath collapsing ruins. Just silence. And the understanding that in trying to build a future without the pain of the past, he had simply rebuilt the cycle. Only this time, there would be no legacy. Only the quiet. He had imagined many endings. Dying in battle. Falling to a stronger Sith, becoming a relic hidden in the dust of forgotten temples. But he never imagined this one. To live after his apprentice walked away, and to feel nothing calling him forward. He had always believed legacy was something earned, a weight passed from master to apprentice, a name shaped by sacrifice and silence. But a legacy requires someone willing to carry it. And she hadn't. Ramage sat alone in the chamber where he once taught her to listen to the Force. The air still held a faint echo of her presence, a warmth that had never belonged to him, a spark he had never known how to shape. He closed his eyes and let the memory settle. Her first question, her first strike, her first victory. The way she once looked at him not as a threat, but as a possibility. He hadn't lost her in a duel. He lost her the moment she realized the galaxy had space for her that did not include him. The wound in his side still ached. But the ache behind his ribs, the one no healer could touch, was worse. Because it wasn't pain. It was emptiness. The kind you feel when the future you built isn't yours anymore. He returned to the archives he had once guarded so carefully. He ran his fingers across the spines of ancient texts, the crystals he had preserved, the artifacts he had hidden. All of it meant for a student who would shape the next era. But none of it belonged to her now. She would write her own path, carve her own truths, forge her own darkness. And whatever she became, Sith or something far stranger, it would not be because of him. He walked through the halls one last time. Not out of grief, out of recognition. This stronghold was not his temple. It was a memory that no longer served him. A monument to a future that died before it lived. He sealed the doors, not with anger, but with acceptance. The stone walls closed with a heavy finality, trapping the dust, the silence, and the remnants of a broken legacy inside. He did not look back. In the wilderness beyond, the winds carried ash across barren plains. Each gust felt like a whisper not from the Force, but from time itself, moving past him the same way Sidious's rise had moved past him. He was no longer a link in the chain. He was the peace the chain had shed. He found a quiet ridge overlooking the valley, and sat where the sun dipped low behind fractured cliffs. The sky burned red not with fire, but with memory. It reminded him of battles he never fought, temples he never rebuilt, and a Sith order he never revived. He exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't lost. He wasn't broken. He was simply unnecessary. And that was the truth he had avoided longer than any wound, any scar, any betrayal. His apprentice hadn't taken his legacy. Time had. She had only shown him what the Force had tried to whisper for years, that whether he trained her or not, the galaxy was not waiting for him. It was moving on. He rose when the stars began to appear, and let the darkness settle around him like an old cloak. There was no fear in him now. No hope, no longing. Only the quiet resolve of someone who understood his role was not to lead, not to teach, not even to endure. It was simply to fade. Not in defeat, not in shame, but in truth. He was the master without a legacy, and in the end, that was all he had ever been. The galaxy no longer watched him. There were no agents hunting him, no Sith seeking his approval, no Jedi sensing his shadow in the Force. Darth Ramage had become exactly what the Rule of Two had promised the Forgotten One. The final breath after 1,000 years of silence. But in that silence, something remained. Not ambition, not anger, not even regret. Just a task. He could not change the past. He could not correct what Sidious had twisted or stop what his apprentice had begun. But he could leave behind something that mattered. Something no one would use but someone might one day find. So he wrote. He gathered what was left of his thoughts, his failures, his buried teachings. He returned to the doctrine that had raised him, not to repeat it, but to preserve it, not as law, but as memory. It was not meant for a student. Not anymore. It was meant for the stars, for time itself. The Force still moved through him, but it no longer spoke with fire. It whispered, like an old voice trying to remember its name. He sat in the lowest chamber of the stronghold, deep beneath stone and sealed metal, where no transmission could reach. And there, he began, not with his name, not with titles, but with what was lost. The old Sith codes, the teachings of Bane, the fractures that destroyed the Brotherhood, the lineage of Darths that ended not in fire but in silence. He wrote of the rule, of its purpose, of how it had worked, and why it had failed. He did not blame the Jedi. He did not curse Sidious. He only told the truth, as he saw it, that the Sith were never defeated by war. They were defeated by forgetting. Each generation rewrote the past. Each apprentice claimed to know better than the last. Each master tried to reshape the darkness into their own image. And slowly, without realizing it, they erased the very legacy they had sworn to protect. Ramage's final doctrine was not a manifesto. It was a warning, a record of shadows, a map through mistakes, a voice beneath the surface of history, not crying out for vengeance, but asking to be remembered. He wrote it in code, in layers of language only the Sith would understand, and even then, only the patient ones, the quiet ones, the ones who didn't seek glory, only truth. Because Ramage knew what the Force had always tried to show him. The greatest power in the galaxy was not domination. It was memory. And memory, once buried, could still be found. Even by accident. Even by someone who never knew his name. He had killed with the Force. He had survived with his blade. But this was different. The doctrine demanded something else. Not strength, not power, but honesty. And that was harder than any duel. Each word he wrote cut deeper than the last. Not because they were painful, but because they were final. These weren't plans. These weren't teachings to guide a living order. They were the remains of something already dead. Still, he kept writing. He wrote of the ones who came before the lords who ruled with fire, the shadows who moved unseen. He wrote of Darth Nihilus, who fed until there was nothing left. Of Darth Treya, who turned her back on the Force itself. Of Bane, who burned the Brotherhood to ashes. And of himself, not as a master, not as a survivor, but as a reminder. He had lived long enough to see the Sith lose their shape. They had become whispers inside political movements, ghosts hiding behind clones and senators. They had forgotten the discipline, the solitude, the terrible patience that made their power last across centuries. So he named it, not to glorify it, to mourn it. He described the truths that no one wanted to hear: how power without loss becomes vanity, how legacy without pain becomes fiction, how every Sith who feared death had already lost, because death was never the enemy. Oblivion was. He wrote in sharp sentences, each like a blade pressed against the future, not to cut through resistance, but to test its edge. He embedded meaning beneath meaning, code inside prophecy, history inside myth, because he knew that if this doctrine were ever found, it would not be understood easily, nor should it be. Only those willing to bleed for knowledge would decipher it. Only those quiet enough to hear the Force beneath words would feel what he left behind. Not rage, not commands, but reflection. He described the difference between conquest and endurance, between fear and control, between rule and ruin. And in doing so, he carved something that no lightsaber ever could. A wound in time. One that might remain long after his bones were dust and his name forgotten. Because that was the real purpose. Not to be remembered, but to make forgetting impossible. A lone archive, buried beneath ancient stone. A single doctrine, written without a reader. A voice, unspoken, yet preserved. He paused, only once, during the writing. And in that stillness he felt something. Not pride, not despair, but clarity. He had nothing left to protect, nothing left to teach, nothing left to lose. And that, he realized, was freedom. There was no plan to return, no trapdoors, no triggers, no holocrons that would activate in his absence. Darth Ramage built the archive not as a vault of weapons, but as a tomb. Not for himself, but for everything that had been lost. The stone beneath the temple was older than the Sith, older than the Republic. It whispered to those who could still listen, and Ramage listened. He carved the final structure into the rock by hand, layer by layer, with tools that hummed with cold memory. There were no droids, no slaves, no dark rituals, just silence. The chamber was circular, with no throne, no altar, no monument to ego. Only a single console, hardwired into a sealed databank, encased in frick to resist corrosion and time. The archive's contents couldn't be sliced, couldn't be copied, and couldn't be read unless one knew exactly how to enter. Because this wasn't meant to be found. It was meant to survive. Even if the stars collapsed, even if the Jedi rewrote the galaxy's history one lie at a time, even if no one ever spoke the name Sith again, this archive would remain. That was enough. He encoded thoughts the galaxy would never want to read. Not teachings of conquest, but of survival. He recorded names that had been erased, lords who had walked quietly between empires, apprentices who never claimed titles, betrayals that never reached the Jedi's ears. The truths behind myths, the motives behind monsters. He wrote of failure not to excuse it, but to explain it, because one day someone would fail again. And when they did, when they crawled back from whatever burning mistake they had made, they might stumble across something buried in the unknown regions, a ruin with no signature, a place the Force itself seemed to forget. And they might listen, not to Ramage's voice, but to their own. The archive did not promise answers. It asked questions. It was a challenge to the future to prove that history was more than survival, that knowledge was more than victory, that the Sith were more than the loudest scream in the galaxy. He sealed the databank without a ceremony. There were no witnesses, no apprentice watching, no one to understand what he had done, and that was the point. He wasn't building a legacy. He was leaving behind a warning disguised as wisdom, a scar in time, one that no war could erase, because no one would know it was even there, except for him and the Force, and perhaps, far into the dark future, someone else. When the doctrine was finished, he did not read it back. There was no need. Every word was already carved into him, burned through memory, sharpened by regret, softened by time. It was the truth he had carried his entire life, finally placed somewhere it could no longer fade with him. He stood at the center of the chamber, the dim red glow of the console lighting the scars along his hands. This was all he had left to give. Not power, not teachings, not revenge. Just remembrance. The galaxy would never know his name. The Jedi would never sense his passing. The Sith would never claim him as part of their lineage. But this archive, this quiet doctrine hidden beyond the edges of every star chart, would remain when everything else burned away. He pressed his palm to the console. The databank locked with a metallic hiss, sealing the doctrine inside layers of encryption so obscure that even he would need days to open it again. He didn't plan to. Some things were meant to be completed only once. He stepped back and listened to the settling of the stone above him. It sounded almost like breathing, as if the temple itself understood the weight of what he had given it. There was no triumph in him, no fear, no sorrow, only stillness. He had tried to rebuild the Sith. He had failed. He had tried to shape an apprentice who could survive him. She had chosen her own path. He had tried to influence a galaxy too loud to hear him. It had moved on without noticing. But here, in this chamber carved from forgotten stone, he had done something no Sith before him had dared. He had told the truth, not the myth, not the threat, not the prophecy, the truth. That power without memory is hollow. That survival without purpose is empty. That the Sith, for all their strength, were always one step away from being lost entirely. He turned toward the exit, the echo of his footsteps carrying through ancient corridors. With each step, the doctrine grew farther behind him, and the world ahead grew quieter. Outside, the air was cold. The sky stretched wide and indifferent. Even the Force felt distant, as if waiting for his final decision. But there was no decision left. Not really. He had written what needed to be written. He had preserved what might one day matter. He had given the galaxy one last whisper, faint, fragile, but true. He looked up at the stars, their light soft against the night. No one would remember him, but someone might remember the words, and that, he realized, was enough. He walked into the darkness without a weapon, without a plan, without a future, just a quiet resolve. His story would not end with fire or blades or empires. It would end the way it had always been lived, in silence, a doctrine left behind, a name carried by no one, a truth waiting to be found. And as the wind closed around him, Darth Ramage finally accepted the fate he had spent a lifetime resisting. He was meant not to be followed, but to be forgotten. No tomb was ever built, no death was ever confirmed, and no one came looking. When Darth Ramage vanished, it didn't echo through the Force, it whispered, quietly, as if even the galaxy itself didn't want to admit it had forgotten him. He left no message, no confrontation, no final duel in firelight, just absence. Some say he walked into hyperspace and never returned, that his ship, a relic held together by will and memory, simply vanished between stars, swallowed by the folds of time. Others claimed he died in meditation, dissolving into the dark side the way Jedi Masters faded into the Force. But there were no witnesses, no evidence, only rumors and silence. His apprentice never searched for him, nor did the Jedi, nor did the Sith, because by the time he was gone, no one remembered who he was supposed to be. The last survivor of a lineage broken 100 years too soon. A shadow cast from a rule long shattered. He had tried to continue Bane's path, to preserve the Sith's purpose through patience and discipline. But the galaxy didn't want that version of the Sith anymore. It wanted spectacle, lightning, chaos, power with no memory. And so, Ramage vanished. Not in defiance, not in surrender, but in understanding, because he had finally learned something no Sith had ever admitted. Sometimes, the most powerful act is to leave without leaving a mark. He erased traces of his presence from old databases, wiped coordinates from long-dead navicomputers, burned holocrons he once studied as a child, not out of shame, but so that his path could not be repeated, so that no one else would carry the burden he had carried of being born into a rule that no longer had meaning. The Sith were still out there, but they were not his. His story ended the only way it ever could. Unseen, uncelebrated, unfinished, and yet not untrue, because even if no one could find where he went, the galaxy would always feel what he left behind. A presence, a doctrine, a whisper, waiting. There were moments scattered, unconfirmed where Ramage was seen, not fully, not clearly, but felt. A Jedi, meditating in the ruins of Ossus, reported a cold whisper before his death. A Sith cultist, lost in the wilds of Vajun, claimed he saw eyes staring from the dark and never returned. In the deep core, a Republic scout ship went silent, its black box transmitting only static and a single phrase repeated in ancient Sith. The phrase was written by Bane, but the voice wasn't his. Ramage had left his body behind, though no one could say where. But the Force, especially the dark side, is not bound to flesh, and what he had become was not immortal, but unkillable in a different sense. He lingered in the edges of memory, not as a ghost, not as a holocron, but as a presence. He did not speak, he did not interfere, but he watched. When Darth Plagueis began his secret experiments, Ramage felt the pain, not physical but historical. This was not the future Bane had envisioned. It was clever, it was cruel, but it was not loyal. When Sidious claimed the title of Dark Lord and brought the galaxy to its knees, Ramage did not celebrate. He watched Coruscant burn under lightning and lies. He saw the Jedi Temple fall, and in the ashes, he said nothing, because it wasn't his victory. And yet, for all that power, Sidious had never heard of him. Nor had Vader, nor had any Sith that followed. He wasn't erased. He was simply never written into their story. But sometimes, when a Sith Lord meditated too long, they heard footsteps behind them that no one else could hear. Sometimes they saw a shadow move where no light had been cast. And sometimes they would awaken from sleep with a name on their lips that made no sense. Ramage. No holocron held his secrets. No archive bore his legacy. But the dark side remembered him. Not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He never screamed. He never claimed a throne. He simply endured. He had lived his entire life inside a command that no longer mattered. Two there should be. No more, no less. The foundation of 1,000 years of Sith survival. The rule that shaped empires, destroyed orders, and rewrote the fate of the galaxy. But by the time Ramage reached the end of his path, the rule of two was already broken, not by him, not by his apprentice, but by time itself. Sidious had twisted it. Vader had misunderstood it. The galaxy had outgrown it. And yet, Ramage remained loyal, not to the Sith of his era, but to the old promise, the one Bane created in blood and fear. The idea that the Sith would survive not through chaos, but through patience, through discipline, through clarity sharpened over generations. He was the last one who still believed, even after his apprentice betrayed him, even after the galaxy forgot him, even after Sidious claimed victory in a war that Ramage never fought. He carried the rule like a wound, deep, old, unseen. And because of that, he became something the galaxy was never meant to witness. A guardian without an order, a witness without a war, a Sith without a successor. The rule demanded an heir. He had none. The rule demanded strength through destruction. He had walked away from every chance to kill. The rule demanded relevance. He lived long enough to lose it. And still, he held on. Not because he believed the Sith would rise again, but because he believed someone should remember why they ever rose at all. In the final years of his vanishing, he became something between life and myth. A ripple in the Force that lingered beside dead Sith tombs. A shadow glimpsed near forgotten battlefields. Some Jedi reported feeling watched during meditation. Some dark side acolytes felt someone judging them in their dreams. None knew his name, but every once in a while, a whisper surfaced in the Force, quiet, steady, tired. One must remain, not to rule, not to destroy, but to remember, because he understood something no surviving Sith ever learned. When a rule breaks, someone must stand among the pieces to keep the truth from disappearing. Ramage was that someone, the last guardian of a broken rule. In the end, his story did not fit anywhere. He was not part of the ancient Sith empires that carved their names into entire star systems. He was not part of the brotherhood that tore itself apart in hunger and pride. And he was not part of Sidious's rise, the grand return of the Sith that rewrote the destiny of the galaxy. He lived between eras, between destinies, between the breaths of history, a Sith who should not exist. Ramage was trained for a legacy that never came, forged by a rule the galaxy no longer respected, shaped by masters who believed patience could outlast time itself. But time moved faster than any doctrine, faster than any prophecy, faster than any scar he carried, and it left him behind. He did not die in battle. He did not fall to a blade. He did not face judgment. He simply faded, not into the Force that honor was reserved for Jedi, not into legend that fate belonged to Sith who screamed loud enough to be remembered. He faded into something quieter, a presence without shape, a memory without name, a truth without a voice. And yet, the Force still bends around the place where he vanished. Travelers swear hyperspace flickers near certain routes in the unknown regions, as if disturbed by something that is not there. Archivists find encrypted fragments in dead systems, patterns too deliberate to be natural, too subtle to be understood. The galaxy cannot remember him, but it cannot fully forget him either, because Ramage represents something the Sith never wanted to face. A life shaped by obedience, but defined by silence. A master who left no apprentice. A survivor who left no mark. A Sith Lord who lived long enough to see his purpose dissolve, and still continued, not for power, not for legacy, but because he believed someone, one day, would need to know that the Sith were more than the monsters history painted them to be. Somewhere in the dark, his doctrine waits. Somewhere beyond the stars, his whisper lingers. And somewhere in the Force, a presence watches patient, steady, impossible. A Sith who should not exist, but does.